basically, I want to give you a little bit of background about myself. I've always been really passionate about movies and video games. It's something I always wanted to be part of. I've always wanted, and I always loved to play 3D. I was actually self-taught at a really young age. I learned some really old, crappy programs like True Space 3D, which I've never really made before. And I was lucky enough to have an uncle who gave me a pirated copy of Maya 1.0, and I ended up learning that, which was a lot more useful than True Space. Eventually, just bumbling around as I got older, I decided to actually go to school and really focus on the CG aspect of it and learn like as much as I could. So I went to Notman School of Visual Effects. I spent almost 2 years there, just fully focused on CG. And at that point, it really helped me. I'm sure maybe like a lot of you guys, I really didn't have a focus. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I liked every part of CG. But I really fell in love with environments while I was there, and the possibilities of kind of creating your own world and all these really cool things. So that's what I focused on and eventually graduated. I was lucky enough to work at Blizzard in the map painting department as my first job. Pretty lucky first job. And from then, I'm now actually working in real-time video games, so doing actual environments for currently the Call of Duty series. So I want to show some stuff here. Hello? Now that you're all deaf. So this is my current demo reel. It's a mix of stuff I worked on at Blizzard and also personal projects. I won't go too much into personal projects. During the demo, I'll talk more about that. But doing personal artwork is really one of the main things that's really gotten me where I am. Obviously, work experience is huge and important, but being able to show people that, like, hey, this is all me, this is everything I've done myself, 100% is a lot more impressive. And people can understand a lot better. Sound. So from that, essentially, as I said, I moved more into in-game environments. So it's a little bit harder to show in-game environments with a cool video and stuff like that. So I've really move more into like the portfolio. And again, a lot of this stuff is really cool stuff, but I might be one of a dozen people who hit some of these sections. So again, having, I might do the majority of some of it, but having your personal work show is really important. As you can imagine, doing this sort of work that's running at 60 frames a second with all sorts of other interactive things happening is quite a bit different than what the work I was doing in Blizzard. And making that transition, I was a little lucky that I was even given the opportunity to make that transition. So quite a wide range of things there. Like I said, map painting stuff and in-game stuff. So I want to talk about map painting a little bit, just to kind of clarify what it is, just in case some of you don't know. It's typically a mix of 2D and 3D stuff. These days it's getting much more 3D, much more aspects of 3D to it. But there's still a lot of painting involved. Back in the obviously 60s, 70s, even beyond, map painting was all just hand. All this stuff for Star Wars was all hand done with paints and brushes, and it's pretty insane. But I was lucky enough to work on a lot of the stuff here for Blizzard, and I would do a lot of the 3D stuff. So I would do a lot of the modeling, texturing, lighting, and get those passes together and put those on. It's really dark. Get those over to the painters. They would do a big paint pass on it, and we would kind of, in compositing and stuff, mix everything together. So for these map paintings, it's really essential. They basically, I want to talk about kind of what the point of like, what this is, right? So when you're working in an environment, when you're learning, you're usually learning the tools, right? You want to learn Maya, you want to learn 3ds Max, you want to learn ZBrush, and you kind of really focus on the tools, and maybe you copy a photograph or copy a concept that you really like, but you tend to forget about like what the point of your environment is. So having a range of things that I've worked on has actually made it really interesting, because I've had been able to see that kind of each aspect has each project I've worked on has had a slightly different point to it, has slightly different goals to it. So yeah, it still needs to make a cool environment, but it also needs to, it has a lot of underlying importance underneath it that isn't always the same. So I want to show just a couple of the cinematics I worked on. They're not super long. This is the ending from Diablo 3. It was very heavily influenced by the map painters. Let's turn it up. Let's see if I can blow everyone's ears out again.
Down the prying eagle forever. A new day breaks for both angels and men. For mankind's greatest champion, the Nephilim, rose to confront the darkness that we, in our pride, would not face. My brethren, I will take my place among you once again. But this time, as a mortal. Since justice has been met this day, I will now stand as wisdom.
single shot in this was handled by the matte painting department up until we get to this interior here. So even shots that are up close like this, these were two separate, I keep saying paintings, but remember a lot of it's 3D that is faded in compositing. And that's one of the reasons that this cinematic was kind of added in at the end and really tweaked a bit to be able to get this kind of grand feel, just because of the tools and stuff that we had. So some of the things that the matte painting department's really in charge of, and things that we were doing a lot, were skies. So pretty much every time you see a sky in the back of a Blizzard cinematic, the matte painting department had a hand in that. Usually it would help with the overall composition, it would help set the mood, but a lot of times it was just needed to be there, it didn't need to draw attention to itself, so it wasn't a big deal. The other things that you see a lot is establishing shots, so things like a shot like this. It's pretty dark, but this is essentially setting a location for the cinematic to continue. So you're, now we know that we need to go in, we're actually going into this church and we're going to have a scene inside this church. And then the other thing is, I call them like the epic shots, basically giving like the really large looks, the shots like with this spaceship crashing and these sorts of like really kind of epic feel to the cinematic. It adds a lot of value to it. I want to show one more video. We did quite a bit in this one as well. This one's for World of Warcraft.
To ask why we fight is to ask why the leaves fall. It is in their nature. Perhaps there is a better question. protect home and family, to preserve balance and bring harmony. For my kind, the true question is, what is worth fighting for?
So, I think it's really one of my favorites, like the humor and the style and stuff involved was great. But as you can see, being able to work with such a just awesome team like that was really, really lucky for me, especially as the first job was kind of insane. This was, unfortunately, it's not the full size. I want to say it was 4K, but it might have been 8K by 8K. At the time, Blizzard wasn't rendering out their final frames even at full HD. So we got to work on that being a bit smaller. But this was all started in 3D. All of it was started in 3D, based actually off geometry from the game, and then it was lit, and then lots of detail I had for painting, trying to keep the style somewhat stylized and that sort of thing. So again, obviously working on with people of that caliber, and especially the map painting team that really focused on the composition, the color, the details, just the full image of an environment was really, really useful and inspiring for me. But once I decided to move on more into in-game things, I was able to kind of have those fundamentals moving forward, even though the challenges of in-game were quite a bit different. So let's take a look at basically I moved into single player stuff. So I like to freeform it a little bit more so I don't have slides so I can kind of bounce around and do whatever. So basically switching into in-game was an interesting switch for me, a lot different techniques and stuff involved. But again, I had that background from the map painting fundamentals that really helped me. But I quickly learned that it had quite a bit different demands for working on a video game. The biggest thing that artists should know when they're working on the game is that it's not really a venue as much for showing off your great artwork and that sort of thing. There's room for that, obviously, but it's a video game. The gameplay needs to really work well, and it needs to be fun, right? Or no one's going to play it. So the main goal is basically whatever your art is, it should really help the gameplay and not really be about just the art. This means working closely with the game designers and the directors to really make sure that everything you're doing is helping. And the biggest difference you'll find between these cinematics and things like an actual real-time game is that you don't necessarily have control over where the player is looking. So in the cinematic, we can do this awesome, great fight scene, these great backgrounds, and we can really make sure, like, hey, you're looking right here, we're shining a light right on it, the camera's moving into it, and it's great. Obviously, with video games, if you've ever, seen your parents play or anything, a lot of times they're looking up at the ceiling or down on the ground, and just confused overall or whatever. And if you play it like me or in my other environment, artist friends were looking at walls and seeing how they did things. But you still got to be able to play the game from there. So one of the biggest things that I've learned is that you need to learn to guide the player, essentially. So we can't really control the camera that much. Some games, and by the way, there's a huge amount of genres in games. Obviously, most of my experience has been with first-person shooters, which is where most of my notes and stuff are coming from. It's completely different for a puzzle game or lots of different stuff. But typically, for first-person shooters, we don't typically like to take the camera control away from the player. A first-person shooter is supposed to be more immersive, right? And so taking the camera away to make it look at something can be kind of disorienting, especially with virtual reality coming out now. It's actually very disorienting. But we can play with that a little bit to help guide the player. We can also have NPCs. Call of Duty, for instance, has a squad that's always coming with you. So if you have a particularly challenging area where you can't get the player to look or do something, you just make all the squad go over to it, and you kind of have to look at it at that point. We can also use color, we can use detail, lighting is a huge one. And all of those will help guide the player to what you need to look at. So it might be an important story element, it might be something you need to solve a puzzle, or it might just be like smoothly getting the player from one part of the level to the other. So, sorry for some of these screenshots, I know they're horrible. I have just a couple different versions or different games and stuff, and screenshots I want to go over. So one of the biggest things is color, right? We use color a lot to help the player. There's just certain things that all players get at this point, which is like red means it's locked, for instance, like this door. Green means it's open. And then other things like this is alien isolation, by the way. They had things like there was this mechanical lock on this door, and it was different than the lock that we just saw here, right? And we were able to you're able to know, okay, it's different, it has a very specific color to it. This needs a piece of equipment to get into it. So that's like one of the most basic ways we use color, is using things that people are used to and people know. So now we know when we see this big orange lock on another door, we probably need a piece of equipment to get through it. I really like the way that The Last of Us handled color. They had these really detailed, complex environments, and they would use yellow. I actually talked to a couple of my friends at work, and I was like, did you realize that they used yellow for The Last of Us to really help guide the player? And a lot of them didn't even remember it because it was kind of done very subtly. But you know when you see this line of yellow, when you're in this detailed area, that you're going the right direction, and there's probably something of importance ahead. All the ladders, for instance, were yellow. Those were things that were interactable, small parts of puzzles and that sort of thing. And you can even see the subtlety that they do here with putting the yellow stripes from the street there as, again, just reinforcing like it's subtle, but this is important. And again, you see it, once you notice it, you can see it throughout. There's even a level where you're literally following yellow lines that are wires through a puzzle that you're trying to solve. And lastly, there's a whole section where there's a big yellow bridge, and for a couple hours of gameplay, you're trying to get to the big yellow bridge, and they keep pointing to it. No one ever mentions that yellow is important in the game. It's never mentioned in a tutorial, but it's kind of it's used to help guide you along. And some of us may have played Mirror's Edge, which is used a lot more, obviously. So there's actually a mechanic, it's called Runner's Vision, I believe, and you can turn it on and it turns everything that's interactable, you need to go to red. So it's very obvious where you're going, and it actually visually is a very interesting visual style. There's a lot of pools and cold colors in the shadows, and so the red really pops with that. And this gameplay, again, it helps the gameplay, right? There's very fast motions that need to be, fast decisions that need to be made, quick motions, and being able to quickly see where you need to go is really helpful, as well as having big red structures that's like, oh, that's clearly my goal, similar to the bridge. This is kind of an interesting shot when you look back at it, because you can totally see exactly the line that the player would need to go. I thought this was interesting. This was actually a piece of fan art when I was looking for screenshots, and this was a kind of like a work in progress. And then as he started adding the red in, it just makes it much more interesting, and you can obviously tell it's supposed to be Mirror's Edge, and it's almost like these pipes are pointing to the door where you're supposed to go. So there's just lots of great ways to use it. And it's become so iconic that when you see cosplay and people dressing up as the characters, there's always some sort of red something behind it. Even though it's part of the mechanic, it's actually become part of like the style of the game. And lastly, this is just some quick ones of a game called Army of Two, and they had one particular area that was very desaturated, and they used these really obvious red signage and stuff like that to help tell the story and help guide the player through the situation. So a little more over the top for that one, but you can see how it can be done fairly subtly as well. the next part that we use a bit more than just color is staging. So what is staging? Well, I don't really know exactly what the definition is, and then probably my definition is probably not correct. But it's something you see a lot in movies where they'll shine a spotlight on an area you're supposed to look, or a character, or something like that. It's also like using deliberate framing and depth of field and contrast to really help show what's important in the frame. So it can be done a lot more subtly in film just because you have more control over it. But in video games, we tend to go a little bit more overt with it just because, again, we have less control. This is from Call of Duty Ghosts. There's this big church that collapses, and it's this big kind of story moment and everything. And one of the ways that we made sure that you saw this was that it's kind of hard to see, but there's essentially this path you have to take along the edge here. So you take that path, which is already funneling you to looking towards it, and then we also have it very brightly backlit. There's high contrast, and obviously movement, but this is very obviously framed for you when it happens. I can't imagine playing through this and not noticing this happen. This is an interesting one because this door is actually the door that we were supposed to go through. So typically, if you want to help the player find something again, you'll add the light shining on it. In this particular instance, it was a stealth section. You were supposed to be sneaky, so adding a big light in front of the door that you're waiting to open at felt really weird. So we ended up having to turn the light off. You can see there was a light up there similar to this one over here. But we did some other stuff where we had a nice lower intensity, warmer light shining on the edge here, and then added the obvious caution striping. And then once again, we're kind of lucky because we get to put the squad mates kind of posted up there. But I think even if the squad mates weren't there, we would know that's probably the place where you're supposed to go. This one's a little bit harder to read. There's a lot more detail happening here. This is a good example of nowadays with the amount of detail that we have and that we can get into video games, we really need to focus more on staging and guiding the player. Though when you are moving, there are things like this light is very specifically shot here, again with bright colors to help lead you into it, and try to tone down some of the lighting in some of the other areas. And then another similar example, where this is the room we were supposed to go into, but we had to finish the artwork off for the rest of the area, so we have another similar room. But for this one, we keep the light on. It's much more bright, much more inviting, and for this one, we make sure to kind of keep the light off and darker, and it doesn't really seem like a very fun place to go in general. And something like this, again, this is another area where was actually a very big story piece, and so we had to make sure that the way it was presented was very obvious. So you walk through a door, and this is the first thing you see, and it's dark at first, and then the lights, do the classic turn on and show this really crazy thing. And it really helps, hopefully, pop the silhouette of what's happening. It's really hard not to look at. And later on, you end up seeing it in another level, being actually utilized. And so hopefully when you see it the second time, you remember, hey, that's that thing I saw that first time, because we kind of stopped and forced you to see it. And even in more linear sections, this part of the level literally just could only go straight. But still using the staging and hitting the contrast back here with the light really helps kind of lead the player to a really cool moment right afterwards. So always thinking about those things is important. So you can see with a lot of this stuff, the fundamentals of creating an interesting image and creating an interesting environment that I've learned and talked about while working for Blizzard is still very much part of it, but it just has a different focus. The focus is gameplay-wise, storytelling-wise, and that sort of thing. So keeping that stuff in mind is really key when you're studying. So after working on some single-player stuff, the game shift, and I was actually able to work on some multiplayer stuff. Once again, switching gears, even though very similar cool environments, still ended up being quite a bit different of a goal overall. So the goals and needs of an environment level, especially for, again, a fast-paced first-person shooter, were quite a bit different. Instead of telling stories and helping people solve puzzles, we needed really quick reads of where you are, where you're going, where the enemies, right? You're usually in combat, you usually have a objective to complete. So those became paramount as opposed to the slower storytelling stuff, not as important. So one of the things that I found that really helped that is theming. So in a single player game, if you die, you usually have a checkpoint that's away from where you just died. You go backwards, it's a safer area, you're not getting shot at, you know where you're at because you were just there, and you can kind of take a breather and move forward back to where you were and try it again. With multiplayer games, when you die, you usually just respawn immediately, and there's usually someone right around the corner trying to shoot you in the face. And again, if it's an objective, you probably need to get from where you are to wherever that objective is as quickly as possible. So you need to know how to do that. So again, theming was what we found really to be just the easiest way to kind of get this across. So this is a map from Halo. I think it was originally Zanzibar. They remade it recently, and I was really impressed with how they remade it. So it had, this is a top-down view. It's a little bit harder to tell the theme, I guess, from here. This might be an older version of it as well. But you have the beach, which is a very obvious place when you start. You have this wall, which is very obvious when you start. You have the big, this big wheel in the middle, and then, so here's some better versions of the wall. And then you have this big metal building on one side that's super obvious. There's nothing else in here that looks like that. It's white, it's orange, it's very obvious. You have the inside area. Once again, all the other inside areas don't look like this. So if you start here, you know where you're at. You know you're going to come out of the big white building and you're going to work your way towards whatever you need to. Just a cool example of when I was actually playing it, I realized that, wow, they did a great job on that. Anywhere I started, it was really easy for me to figure out where I was. So this is a map that I worked on. There was a remake of a map for Call of Duty. So again, you can see theming happening here. Things like putting obvious equipment, right? This big construction equipment really helped. We had this tent here was green. We had another tent that was white. We have another area with a big meteorite in it. And there's an underground section that's being excavated. So all of these sections are very obvious and different. Whereas if everything looked like these white tents everywhere, it would be extremely confusing about where you were, even in a small map like this. Here's the green section. Again, you could start here and know, okay, in the green section. Very obvious. Similar with this section. Even though there's other white tents, this is the only one with the giant meteorite in it. It's kind of hard to not figure out where you are. So areas that we didn't do as well, and I worked on multiple maps, and even though sometimes you kind of understand that theming is important and all of that, but then you're under pressure to make this new map and all these things, and there's this kind of art direction going for it, and sometimes you forget some of the fundamentals. So this is kind of not necessarily a fail, but we didn't quite do as well as the other one, I feel like. So this map with it, it's another remake as well, and we tried to go with this really fun kind of Running Man, kind of post-apocalyptic war game type scenario. It's really fun and bright and colorful. There were some areas like the stage here that were pretty obvious if you start at the stage and you know where you're at. But I think if you look at some of these pictures, it's pretty hard to tell the difference of any of them. And it became pretty confusing. In one way, it kind of helped with the gameplay. It had this very fast-paced, chaotic gameplay that was reminiscent of the original version of it. But in other ways, it was kind of frustrating. You'd get shot in the back and not know which direction to go and stuff like that. And another example of DLC map, I didn't actually work on this one myself, but this is a really beautiful map, but it ended up having so much foliage and so much detail in it that it became very hard to tell where any one section was. There wasn't a lot of theming in it. It was all overgrown and it was all ruins, and that was pretty much it. Another interesting thing that comes from that sort of stuff. But things like car and pit and long doors and stuff like that, those are all things that were added in specifically by the level designers and by the artists, and those actually become lingo for the game. Again, slightly different needs for a multiplayer game. One of the things that we found too is using colors, so kind of going back to color a little bit. So I told you there was that one kind of running man crazy level where we were having a hard time having people kind of realize where they were. So basically, we were like, oh, maybe we'll make one side red and one side blue. It's a common thing that happens in kind of symmetrical mirrored levels. This is from the original Halo. Super symmetrical, right? And then it's got the red side and the blue side. It's easy to know which side you're on from that point. Not even that themed that hard, and I'll go into that for why in a second. This is old Unreal Tournament as well, completely symmetrical level, blue side, red side, you know which side you're on. But one of the things that you'll notice, one of the reasons why that works so well actually is because the graphics back then were much more simplified. So you can have these big blue lights and be like, okay, that's the blue side. Once you start getting into the more complex scenes, just having a red wall and just having a blue wall doesn't actually help you really know where you're at. So our biggest issue here was that we didn't have enough individual theming in these sections to have the colors actually do what they were trying to do. And you can see it's a very symmetrical level. So if I started in this corner or this corner, just looking is not really going to help me very much. One map more recent map that I think did a great job is Team Fortress 2. It's one of the classic maps, 2-Fort I believe it's called, and they have a symmetrical map as you can see from the top down. And a lot of competitive games try to have symmetrical maps, especially if they're objective based, so one side doesn't have an advantage over the other side. And so you can see this side is the red kind of barn, older section, so it's very much color-coded, but compared to the other side, which is blue and more industrial, it's also themed very differently. So they kind of hit the mark perfectly with kind of the best of both worlds there. So this is kind of the last section I have. Kind of like it's a little bit of a shotgun stuff with things that I've learned and stuff like that. So if you guys are following along, but one of the more interesting things. So we talked about kind of like where you are, right? Like when you start somewhere, you need to know where you are. But also, it's really important in a first-person shooter or a competitive game to be able to kind of tell where you can go, and almost more importantly, like where enemies can go. So in this example, I think we themed this area well, where it's obvious where you're at when you're here, but a lot of new players, when either they would run in here or start here, would actually think that they could go into this area here that I created. And I wanted to put it there because I thought it was cool, and I kept arguing for it. And over again, people were saying, it's pretty confusing, dude. But we ended up keeping it in, but I think if we would have done something just more simple, it would have been more obvious. You're actually supposed to go around this meteor here and actually exit that way. And again, in a fast-paced game, people would be running up, trying to get out this way and immediately get shot, whereas if they were looking in the proper direction, it wouldn't have necessarily happened. This is another example of an area where we kind of overcomplicated it. Again, not a level I worked on, but a shift with the game that I worked on. And really beautiful artwork, but some of the areas where there's balconies, there's open staircases. It's a little bit hard to tell if you should be looking up there and if you're going to be shot at or not. And so, taking the time maybe to have smoothed out some of those areas, brick them off, and then maybe adding some less porous shapes could really help drive where you're supposed to be going with that. Another important one was skylines. So this is one of the reasons why this particular map was so confusing, is the skyline was all the same. We were technically in an arena, and the arena was the same on all sides. And so if you remember looking back at the Mirror's Edge thing with the bright obvious, right? There's like, okay, I need to go there. If this had a big bright red tower on one side, it might be a little bit more obvious like what direction I'm facing. But because in this middle here, you can see all the skylines look very similar, it's really hard for players to kind of get their bearings on where they were. We did try and compensate a little bit, so you can actually see this area has this really big screen, and the screen's constantly changing, a lot of stuff is happening. And then this area has this stage where there's lights coming down. But really, people weren't really looking up that much, and it wasn't different enough for people to really take advantage of. So it became very confusing. And again, talking about complexity, right? Where can you go? Where can I get shot from? This scene, believe it or not, you can actually go behind this thing. You can go this way, you can go behind this structure, you can get up on this ladder, or people can be coming from the left or the right or behind you. It's a lot of area to keep in mind when you're trying to work something out competitively. And we really did the player a disservice by putting so much detail in all of this, where if someone was hiding back there or crouching back there, it'd be really hard to actually see that person. And again, this is the jungle scene, so it's so much detail and so much noise that it's actually quite hard to tell when someone's coming after you. One thing that we thought was fun though is we did this every once in a while, and this doesn't show well when you're not moving, but when you're in this chaotic game, we actually do have these posters that are silhouettes of people with a gun, and we put them behind cover kind of, and again, we wanted this particular level to feel pretty chaotic. So, if you catch it in the corner of your eye when you're trying to do something, you actually might kind of freak out and shoot at it a little bit, thinking that it was someone there. We've actually had, there's a fire hydrant in another level that was totally not on purpose put there to freak someone out, but everyone kept thinking it was someone, and so we kept it in just because it was kind of fun to mess with people. But doing it purposefully is usually better than confusing the crap out of everybody. And again, as a Counter-Strike player, I find their examples are really awesome. So their new Counter-Strike Global Offensive has these really, the graphics look good, but they spent a lot of time to keep the ground and the floors, the floors of the walls very clean. There's not a lot of crap all over them, so it's really easy to see your enemy. It's really easy to see your objectives. They pop really easily. There's not too much going on. And in a game like this, which is very much, it's fine if you kind of mess up a little bit in Call of Duty and you can respawn. In Counter-Strike, it's very upsetting when you die. You see this a lot. They have the details of the area put up past where the players would actually be. And so you get an easy, clean read on people. So that's pretty much what I have, but I want to end with just knowing while you're working on stuff, while you're studying, while you're learning the programs, to keep in mind what your goal is. Are you just learning? Awesome, great. Learn the tools, do your thing. But are you trying to make a video game environment? Well, in that case, really spend the time to figure out what the goals of that video game environment are and work towards that. Are you trying to make a short film or an animation? Really consider the overall frame and what you're doing, not just click this button,